Hey everybody, welcome to week 11 of PS 398. We're getting to the final countdown here, and I just want to make sure that you're all doing okay. There's only so much that I can do, as you may have surmised, but we only have a little bit more time together, and I want to make sure that you know that if there's anything that I can do to be of some help to you, even if it's just a matter of liaising, just let me know. You've all been doing a really good job, and I really appreciate your sense of professionalism throughout the class. I don't have no obligations to you, So, if there's anything that you need these last couple of weeks with this final countdown, please just let me know, okay? So in the previous two lectures, we have incorporated time into our Book of Fables. So 2 weeks ago, we introduced the notion of an extensive form game, which was just a game, right? I mean, there's a set of players, there's a set of actions, and there's a set of preferences over the combinations of actions, so it's a game. We can look in an extensive form game and say, hey, what are its Nash equilibria? Just the same way as we could chicken or matching pennies or assurance. But we learned last week that we can also go a lot further. So we don't just use time to tell interesting stories, we use time to conduct interesting analysis. And hopefully, backward induction and subgame perfection, that lesson of what it is to be time respecting, not just when you're telling stories, but when you're analyzing them, I hope that lesson stuck. And part of my goal for today is to turn that up to 11 to make sure that you can see how the shadow of the future matters in international relations theory. You may have noticed that we only discussed discrete choice games throughout last week's lecture. So we talked about a deterrence game, we talked about the rule of law game, we talked about extended deterrence. But we didn't talk about the ultimatum or anything else where you might strategically set a slider, choose a level, draw a border, set a tax rate. Nothing where you're choosing some number out of a lot of numbers. And there are two reasons for that. One, it's a little bit trickier, just in a technical sense, so that style of analysis requires a little bit more care on the analyst's part. And so it was worth making sure that we partitioned this week to make sure that this was a lesson that seemed like its own independent lesson on the technical side. But perhaps more importantly, we also will be learning some complementary lessons about the role of time as we think about bargaining as a dynamic process. So we talked about bargaining in week 4 or 5, or what is time right now? We talked about bargaining a while ago, and we talked about what constitutes a bargaining problem. We did that from the perspective of Pareto optimality, and we talked about sort of the core of bargaining. What is a bargaining problem? But we didn't talk about how to analyze games where bargaining is an important part of the flavor. The only prediction that we've gotten out of a bargaining model so far has been from Nash bargaining, which you did on the problem set after bargaining week. And I'm sure that you'd like to forget that problem set just as much as I'd like to forget that lecture, but here we are, ashamed of ourselves and doing our best. Game theoretic analysis of bargaining games, Ultimatum game and its cousins, they play a really important role in international relations theory, the theory of international security, a lot of theories of international political economy. These are very important models throughout international relations as it's known at the present moment. All this to say, while it might seem like I've left things aside for technical reasons, I hope that the pregnant pause of a full week in between these two lectures, I hope that also makes obvious the fact that I want you to view this as an important substantive lesson today as well. They're all substantive lessons if you ask me, it just might not always be obvious all the time. But I hope that this feels as substantive as the first time that you got exposed to politics among nations or anything like that. So, I don't want to motivate things too much because I want this to feel somewhat continuous with respect to the last two lectures, but everything that I said at the beginning of the bargaining lecture also applies here. So the current understanding about war is that it is itself a bargaining problem. Tom Schelling's quotes about conflict essentially being a bargaining situation apply just as much. Clausewitz's talk about how a war is just the continuation of politics by other means applies just as well. It's just now that we're deep enough into the theory that you should be able to appreciate some of these points just from seeing them. You're getting taste too. You're getting your own thoughts on these things too. Now it's not just a matter of you reading what somebody said and saying, oh, that's what somebody said. And next time I go to a dinner party and somebody says, hey, do you happen to have a Karl von Clausewitz quote handy? Told you I'm guessing about what's happened at these dinner parties. You know, it's not just about that. It's about how you interface with the fables. It's about the lessons that you personally learn in your own language. You know, it's not just about reading great thinkers that came before you, which is super important, don't get me wrong. It's also about what you get from the interaction with the fable, you know? And I think that applies to literary fables. Like, you know, books that are important to you aren't just important to you because of what critics thought about them, and they're not just important to you because of the actual objective literary quality, in as much as something like that exists. A book that matters to you for reasons that go beyond that. It's about how you interface with them. And likewise here, I hope that you're beginning to learn your own lessons. If I was good at this, then I would only be a facilitator. I wouldn't be teaching you anything. I would be showing you the things that teach you. And I think that now many of you are getting enough proficiency that you can learn your own lessons. So let's go learn some lessons. In the A block, I want to talk about how we analyze the Ultimatum game and some of its very close cousins. The Ultimatum game is the core, basic, building block canonical bargaining model. It's everybody's first game theoretic bargaining model. And so learning how to analyze it well will hone your intuitions as we talk about more elaborate, extensive, seemingly realistic whatever models. The Ultimatum game, that is the core DNA. It is the foundation. It is the thing that makes game theoretic bargaining game theoretic bargaining. Everything you need to know is in the Ultimatum game. The Ultimatum game is just a potato head doll begging to have a hat or glasses or nose or mustache put onto it. So learning it all the way is one of the core lessons of a class like this, because it is currently how most international relations scholars view important crises. In the B block, I want to modify that Ultimatum game to make it something more explicitly under the umbrella of the bargaining model of war. The bargaining model of war is one of the current workhorse models in international relations. Being able to understand it well is one of the key things I would want somebody to leave this class with. And so modifying the Ultimatum game in a relatively straightforward way to allow for inefficient conflict, that's a really important part about learning Ultimatum. And so we'll talk about how to analyze a slightly more elaborate bargaining model of war type Ultimatum game in the B block. And then the C block, really I want to set the stage for part of your problem set. So I want to talk about the problem of preventative war. So preventative war is one of the ultimate time-respecting fables in international relations. I might not want to fight you today, but I fear that tomorrow you will become strong. And so I have no choice but to attack potentially while I am strong today, because I fear whom you will become tomorrow. Right? So this is very Godfather 2 type logic. Oh, did I just ruin Godfather 2 for you? First of all, close this. Go watch Godfather 1, 2. Don't watch Godfather 3. Promise me you'll never watch Godfather 3. Promise. The problem of fearing an enemy that isn't strong today but could become strong tomorrow, this is at the core of a lot of interesting tensions. Classic Greek mythology is full of it, right? I'm sure that other mythologies are full of it too. It's sort of a core tension, being afraid of the next generation. And this seems to be somewhat relevant, and I won't opine on this too much, but this seems to be relevant for many international relations theorists thinking about what the next 20, 25, 50, 100 years might look like at the international level in the real world that we're experiencing as we speak. So it should be a pretty fun lecture. There's going to be a lot of little annoying mathematical wrinkles along the way, but if we keep our grip light, if we're nimble, if we're flexible, we'll be able to just get past all of those hurdles as they emerge, and then when we get to the top of this little part of the mountain, we will see a beautiful view about how time and bargaining play together to influence strategic actors and/or anarchy. Let's get started. So here in the A block, I want to begin our journey about bargaining in war. And to do that, we're going to spend some time analyzing the most basic bargaining model of them all, the Ultimatum game, sometimes called the take it or leave it game. I like Ultimatum the best. Doesn't that sound pretty cool? Well, before we talk too much about what the name of the thing is, we might as well just cue it up, right? I am tired of this guy already. This guy is terrifying. I don't know what I was thinking when this all happened. And you know, I've had many chances to get rid of this guy. I'm the god of his Adobe world, right? I mean, but, you know, I've taken a bit of a liking to him. We're our own little odd couple here, him and me. I gotta keep myself entertained one way or another. All right, so remember that the idea of the ultimatum game is that at the beginning of time, state A is going to choose some X. They're going to make an offer, so they're going to choose some X that lives somewhere between 0 and 1. Okay? So here's X equals 0, here's X equals 1, here's X equals 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 3/4, 7/8, whatever. So, importantly, like, this is a whole continuum, right? So, there's an uncountably infinite number of numbers that live in between 0 and 1. So, at the beginning of time, we make this offer. We call it X. So, X is some number between 0 and 1. X equals 2/3, X equals 1/2. And the idea here is that X is how much of the good in question State A is going to keep for herself. State B observes the offer. Right? There's no information sets or anything like that in this game. So State B observes that offer, and then conditional on that offer that they observe, they can either accept or reject. If State B accepts the offer, then the associated utilities in the simplest form of the bargaining model are X and 1 minus X. So State A gets to keep X, and State B keeps 1 minus X. And remember that X is endogenous. So the happiness that is experienced, right? So the amount of happiness that the two states feel is determined not by outside factors, not by parameters, but rather by a strategic choice made by State A at the beginning of time. However, if the offer is rejected, then both states receive a disagreement point payoff of 0 happiness points apiece. And we'll be adjusting those numbers throughout today's lecture. You'll see it plays a pretty big role, but for now I don't want that to be the start of the show just yet. So here's our ultimatum game. And before we move on to the analysis, let me just demonstrate that it is in fact a bargaining game. Right? So what do I mean by that? Well, bargaining problems have two characteristics. Do you remember them? There's another video. I'm not trying to get my views up. Right? This is not me trying to artificially inflate the views of the YouTube videos, but I do know that one of the previous videos had a whole lot on this particular subject. So I'll pause. I'll let you go over there if you need to. Welcome back to the none of you that left. Okay. So why is this a bargaining problem? Well, two things. One, observe that the states have conflicting preferences over the happy outcomes. So in particular, notice that country A wants X to be high. They're happy as X get higher and higher. Their happiest outcome is X equals 1. Their least favorite outcome is X equals 0. State B, on the other hand, wants X to be low. So they get 1 happiness point when X is at 0, and they get 0 happiness points when X is at 1. So they have completely... This is a zero-sum game. Well, they add to 1, but it's a constant sum game. So that's part one of what makes bargaining is conflicting preferences. Right? So if it's a car, you can imagine a car dealer is choosing a price for a car, that's X. And then the customer can either accept or reject. The second thing that makes bargaining is that disagreement is costly. Well, here, disagreement is in fact costly in the sense that it is Pareto dominated. So 0-0 is Pareto dominated by every possible X1 minus X pair when X lives between 0 and 1. What do I mean by that? Well, notice that think about every pair of the form X1 minus X when X lives between 0 and 1. Every utility imputation. Suppose for now that X equals 1. Well, that means that state A has 1 happiness point and state B has 0. Well, 1-0, that outcome Pareto dominates 0-0 because at least one state A, is strictly better off, and the other state B, is indifferent. So everybody is at least as well off, and at least one person is strictly better. So that's the definition of Pareto dominance. So 1-0, Pareto dominates 0-0. The same would have gone if if x was equal to 0 so that state B was the all the way happy one and state A was indifferent. And for any intermediate outcome, 1/2, 1/2, 3/4, 1/4, 1/8, 7/8, all of those intermediate possibilities, well, for both of those, both parties are strictly happier with the agreement as they would be with disagreement. So disagreement is costly in a very precise sense. The disagreement point is Pareto dominated by every possible outcome on the accept side. So how do we analyze this thing, right? How are we going to... So this is a game with terminal nodes? We talked about what to do with a game like that last week, right? So we need to find subgames that go only to terminal nodes, because terminal nodes as of right now are the only solved nodes. This raises an interesting question. How many subgames are in this game? How many decision nodes are there? How many things are we going to have to solve? You can pause the video. Pause the video and answer the following question. How many subgames are there in this game? Remember, a subgame is a subset of the nodes that doesn't break apart an information set, ends only in terminal nodes, and has a unique root node. How many of those are there in this ultimatum game that we've drawn? Pause the video. Welcome back to the none of you that paused the video. Oh, I'm sure at least one of you paused the video because you had to go make some coffee or something. If you answered infinity, you're right. This game has an infinite number of subgames. Infinite number of subgames, and we're gonna have to solve them all. Ugh, I don't want to think about that just yet. Let me just show you that there's an infinite number of subgames. Let's think about that. Let me just call your attention to a couple of subgames, okay? There's a subgame that starts with state B's decision after observing the offer x equals 0 and goes to the end of the game. So that's all the way here, right? That's all the way here. X equals 0. Now I've got state B's decision node. It's right there. And they have an accept reject decision to make there. Similarly, there's another subgame that starts with what happens when x equals 1. So I can flip all the way to the other side of the Assassin's Creed hoodie. And there's another one right there. There's a subgame that starts with state B's decision after observing x equals 1. Right? I mean, it's right there. There's one with x equals 1/2, right? You might be thinking, oh, well, I'm just taking advantage of numbers that I've heard of. That's true. That's a problem. Okay, so take your birthday. Take your birthday and convert it to an 8-digit number using the following algorithm. The first 4 digits are the year in which you were born. The next 2 digits are the month in which you were born, and after that are the days in which you were born, right? So I'm not going to tell you mine, but Chewy's are 2015. No, 20. Kendra, what year was Chewy born? So, for example, Chewy's 8-digit number is 20160525. Okay, well, that over 1 plus that, right? That's a number between 0 and 1. Chances are good it's really close to 1, unless you were very old. Like, really old. That number, I've never heard of that number. Right? That number is your number. And there's a subgame that starts from that number. State B observes an x of your birthday over 1 plus your birthday. And makes a choice. So there's a lot of numbers. There's a lot going on in there. There's a lot of subgames in here, right? I mean, that's what gave state A so much flexibility, was the fact that there was going to be so many possibilities for state B to have to think through. In order for us to be able to do backward induction, we need a complete contingency plan about what state B is going to do at every possible decision. Not just the one that happens. Because we need to know if state A is happy with the offer that they made. And we'll only know if state A is happy with the offer that they made if we know what state B would have done at other offers, right? That's kind of the whole thing. is if we can't think through the infinite hypothetical worlds. If we can't think through those infinite hypothetical worlds, first of all, the physicists that do the multiverse stuff are all going to be really confused. Second of all, we aren't going to be able to determine an equilibrium, which is bad. That's way worse than bad physics, if you ask me. So what are we going to do? We have to solve every one of these uncountably infinite subgames. There are more subgames than there are counting numbers. Right? There's a subgame for every real number. It's massive. It's massive. It's massive. We have a gigantic problem on our hands. Gigantic, enormous, terrifying, disappointing problem. We thought we were going to solve this really important model, and we had this cool tool that we learned last week, and everything was so easy, and you just highlight the edge, and you make that one orange, and you make that one blue, and look how cool everything looks. And now here we are, and it's very cold and very dark, and I don't know what to do with all these subgames. Because a strategy for player 2, a strategy for state B, a strategy for state B, a strategy for state B is what they would do at every one of those. Every one of them. There's no way that we can solve all those one at a time, right? So last week we had all these subgames and we just went, I solved that one, I solved that one, I solved that one, I solved that one. We were like Oprah giving out cars, except we were solving subgames. It was all so easy. And now there are way too many for us to do, because if you and I and every other human on this earth spent nothing, if the only thing that we did for the rest of our lives, if we said, you know how we're going to fight back against COVID? What we're going to do is we're going to crowdsource solving the Ultimatum game. And we all started. We all got a little range. We all got a little range of the hoodie. Right, here's my piece of the hoodie, and here's your piece of the hoodie, and here's Chewy's piece of the hoodie, and here's Chancellor Jones' piece of the hoodie. Every one of us gets a little piece of the hoodie, and that's our responsibility. That little piece of the hoodie is our responsibility. Take this hoodie and divide it 6 billion ways, or however many people there are. Take the hoodie and divide it that many ways, and give every individual on the earth a slice. And then what they're supposed to do for the rest of their life, every second of every day, they will identify a subgame within their range and determine whether or not state B would rather accept or reject at that subgame. What's the sequentially rational thing for them to do with that subgame? Right? So in my range, let's say my range was the one that started at 0 and went up to 1 over 6 billion. So I would start at maybe 0 and I'd solve that one. Well, at x equals 0, state B is getting 1 happiness point, and they're really enthused about that. So they would accept. Call that node solved. Now I got to go up a bit. To what? 1 over what? I could do this for every second for the rest of my life and not come anywhere close to being done with my tiny little piece of the Assassin's Creed hoodie. I could do this forever because I don't know after x equals 0 what's next. Let's say that I said next up was 1 over 10 trillion. That's a very tiny number. That's an infinitesimal number. But along the way, I skipped an infinite number of numbers. The real numbers are a very special friend, right? There's a lot going on in there. I can't do my little part of the hoodie, and you can't do your little part of the hoodie. None of us can do our little part of the hoodie because even though we're crowdsourcing this and even though we made each of the jobs tiny, they're still huge. So what are we going to do? We can't solve the nodes. How are we going to solve the nodes? We don't. What's a strategy? What's a strategy for state B? What's a strategy for state B? You know, in the rule of law game, a strategy for faction A in the rule of law game was if both transgressed, what do you do? If they only transgressed A, what do you do? If they only transgressed B, what do you do? And they didn't transgress anybody, what do you do? Right? So there were four possible decisions, and we needed to know what they did at each one of those. Here, there's an uncountably infinite number, so we don't know, right? So we need something that can read in all of those x's, because each x pins down a unique subgame. Right? If you gave me x equals 1/2, that pins down a unique subgame starting from state B. If you gave me x equals 3/4, that pins down to unique subgames starting from state B. If you gave me your birthday over 1 plus your birthday, that pins down a unique subgame. So if I could come up with a function that reads in x's and spits out accept reject, then I'd be good. State B is a function. State B is a function. State B is just a function. State B, their strategy is a function. What they do is they observe x's, they see the x's, and they react. A function is the only way that we could do this, because otherwise we'd be stuck sort of like trying to do these one at a time, you know, and we would just sort of like looking like Animal in the Muppets, you know, playing drums. Like we need a function so that I can't do this like this. I can't do much of anything like this. So what am I going to do, right? So we need a function. We need a function. We need something that reads in x's and spits out accept or reject. Well, let's think that through. Let's think that through. Thankfully, this function is going to be very straightforward most of the time. So suppose that x was strictly less than 1, which is most of the x's, right? That's most of the x's. If x is strictly less than 1, that's all of them except for this one. And that's all the x's except for this extreme point, the extreme side of the hoodie. We're good. If we can get that much handled, we're in pretty good shape. Well, notice, if x is strictly less than 1, then 1 minus x, which is state B's payoff, 1 minus x is strictly greater than 0, right? 1 minus x is strictly greater than 0 so long as x is strictly less than 1, which is most of the x's. Okay, well then the only sequentially rational thing that state B could do there is accept, right? So even if we made them even if x was really close to 1, x is a googol over 1 plus a googol. That's really close to 1, right? However, it isn't 1, which means that the resulting 1 over 1 plus googol that state B would get is strictly greater than 0. It's tiny, but it's still strictly greater than 0. It might not be perceptible. We might have a cups of coffee problem in our hands. But for the purposes of the theory right now, that's strictly positive. They accept. They accept any offer. They accept any offer where x is strictly less than 1. They have to. Okay? But now suppose that x equals 1. If we get this handled, then we'll be all the way done. Let's suppose that x equals 1. Well, if x equals 1, then 1 minus x, which is state B's payoff for accepting. If they accepted, they would get 1 minus x, which equals 0. And if they reject, then they would get their disagreement point payoff, which is 0. Well, they're indifferent. So which would they do? Either is plausible. So we can't say. We don't know. We'll have to consider both of those contingencies separately. Right? We'll have to consider the situation where state B accepts when indifferent, and we'll have to consider the world where state B rejects when indifferent. Those will be two separate contingencies. We have to study them separately because either one could emerge independently. You know, for all of my panic attack there, actually this wasn't that bad, right? So now you can consider all of state B's decision nodes solved because we know what state B would choose to do at each of those. At the uncountably infinite set of decision nodes they could make, where x is strictly less than 1. State B observes that they would be getting a payoff strictly greater than 0, and chooses to accept. And at the single point where x equals 1, this is kind of a big deal. You'll see this is going to come up a couple of times. At that single point, state B, when they're indifferent, could either accept or reject. So we consider all those nodes solved. We're good. We're done with state B. So let's go up a step. Let's go to state A's decision at the beginning of time. Well, at the beginning of time, state A is saying, well, I could choose any x, right? And I have to choose an x to try to maximize my utility. I want to choose the best x, right? Essentially, I want to make the best equilibrium path that I could. Well, let's think that through. Let's think about the ultimate payoff, given that strategy that we just pinned down for state B. Let's think about a strategy for state B. Hold it fixed. That's backward induction. And then say to ourselves, well, state A, looking down the tree, can expect what payoff given each x. Okay. And let's suppose to begin that state B rejects when indifferent. So let's say that if x equals 1, so that 1 minus x equals 0, so that state B is indifferent, let's say that state B rejects when indifferent, okay? And let's think our way through x. Let's think our way through the whole 0, 1 interval and think about what payoff state 1 could expect. Well, if x equals 0, state B would accept, and state A would get 0. If x equals a quarter, state B would accept that. That's strictly less than 1. That's part of the strategy, right? So state B would accept, and state A would get a quarter of a happiness point. If x equals 1/2, state B would accept, and state A would get a half a happiness point. 3/4, state B would accept, and state A would get a 3/4 of a happiness point. 7/8, state B would accept, and state A could get 7/8 of a happiness point. 15/16, state B would accept, and state A would get 15/16 of a happiness point. 31/32, state B would accept, and state A would get 31/32 of a happiness point. 63/64, state B would accept, and state A would get 63/64 of a happiness point. 127/128, well, state B would accept, and state A would get 127/128 of a happiness point. 255/256, state B would accept, and state A would get 255/256 of a happiness point. 511/512, state B would accept, and state A would get 511/512 of a happiness point. 1, state B would reject, and state A would get 0 happiness points. Wait a second. So what that means? So state A is doing better and better and better and better. They're climbing the mountain, and then they fell off. Wait a second. So what's the x that maximizes this? Which x gets us to the top of this mountain? Which x? What is the strictly highest number, strictly less than 1? There isn't one. There is not one. Let's say that you thought you had it pinned down. You're like, my favorite number, we'll call it y. Let's say that your favorite number is y, and you say to me, you know what? I think I found the largest number, strictly less than 1. And I'd be like, hey, that's pretty great, because now the Ultimatum game just got a lot more interesting. And I would say, but by the way, what about your favorite numbers? Let's say it was y. Y plus 1 over 2 is higher than your number and strictly less than 1. There is no highest number. There is no equilibrium of this type. There is no equilibrium where state B rejects when indifferent. There is no subgame perfect equilibrium where state B rejects when indifferent. There isn't one. This is a big lesson. There is not an equilibrium where state B rejects when indifferent. There isn't one. Why? Well, the issue is actually this infinity thing. So imagine instead that the Assassin's Creed hoodie was just like a bunch of spaghetti, so that it wasn't continuous. Actually, the world was in discrete chunks. I could only divide $1 into pennies, or I could only divide land into states. Discrete units, not infinitely divisible like what we were just discussing. Okay? And let's say that you were currently playing the strategy that you rejected when indifferent. You're state B in this example now. Congratulations, you're now a state. So you're playing the strategy where you reject when you're indifferent. Okay. Let's say that I offered x equals 1. Well, you're rejecting when indifferent, so you would reject that. So then I would say, okay, whatever is the next highest one, I'm going to offer that. I don't have an optimization problem. I don't have to find the largest number strictly less than 1 anymore. I just need to find the next highest thing. Right? So I would choose that, you would accept it, and we'd be done. That would be the unique subgame perfect equilibrium of this game. But it's not like that. It's continuous. Imagine that the units of the currency were very small so that you could divide it perfectly. Or imagine that the territory was very large and flat and without a whole lot of features so that you could divide it perfectly. Genuinely divisible. This is what divisibility is. When we introduced the possibility of indivisibility, we introduced the possibility of war just through that alone. That was on one of the problem sets too, right? So actually, if we want to not have war arise for borderline chintzy issue and divisibility reasons, then we have to have the full-on Assassin's Creed hoodie, which means that there is no equilibrium where state B rejects when indifferent. So you can have it one way or the other, but you can't have it both. And this all sounds super abstract and super mathematical, and part of it is, but part of it isn't. I mean, this is very conceptual. If something can't be broken down, then it can be fought over for that reason. But if it could be broken down, then it introduces all sorts of wrinkles about how to properly make offers over it. There's no free lunch with this thing. So suppose instead that state B accepted when they were indifferent. State B reads in an offer and they say, okay, well, I will accept x equals 1. So I accept x strictly less than 1, and I accept strictly x equals 1. That's a very kind state B. This is the world's nicest state B, but let's just go with it because right now we're out of options. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any equilibria. We'd be dead. The funding agency would have apparently sent assassins for us, and we know what they'd be wearing. The thing that you don't know in all of this is that part of my soundproofing is a hoodie. So I wish I could turn my iPad around, but part of my soundproofing for when I make these is a hoodie. And so I'm looking at my own little Assassin's Creed hoodie as I give Assassin's Creed hoodie talks every time. That's way more than you want to know about how these movies get made. Let me tell you, you don't want to know how these movies get made. I don't want to know how these movies get made. So suppose that state B was accepting when indifferent, that the world's nicest state B. Well, now things are easy, right? I don't have a problem. I don't have to find the highest number strictly less than 1. I can just set x equals 1, you accept it, and we're done. That's the subgame perfect equilibrium of the game. State B accepts all offers. They accept any offer featuring x less than or equal to 1, which is to say every x. State A offers x equals 1. That's the equilibrium. That's it. That's the equilibrium. That's the unique subgame perfect equilibrium of the Ultimatum game. The unique subgame perfect equilibrium of the Ultimatum game, it relies on state B accepting when indifferent. Now, before we go too much further, let me just say, you sometimes see in a criticism of the Ultimatum game or of game theory more generally, people say, oh, and then you have to assume that state B accepts when indifferent. No, you don't. You don't have to assume anything. I'm not sure if you noticed, but we considered very thoroughly the possibility that state B rejected when indifferent. I went up and down on this slide a whole bunch of times, right? We went up to the spaghetti hoodie. That's how seriously we took it, is I had to draw a spaghetti hoodie. I took that contingency so seriously that I spent another 20 minutes drawing another picture. I considered it very seriously, and I found that no equilibria of that class existed. It is not an assumption that state B must accept when indifferent for there to be an equilibrium. It's a result. That's something that we just learned. We just learned that. We didn't assume it. We learned it. We inferred it. We deduced it. Everywhere you look, there's tiny little lessons. And it's easy to say, oh, that one's stupid, that one is stupid. Any given little lesson that you learn may be stupid, it's true. But then you accumulate the stupid lessons, and next thing you know, you have a mountain of stupid that is itself not stupid. Notice that the Ultimatum game has a really tragic outcome. I mean, it's just really bad, right? Because, look, State B has nothing. They got nothing out of this. State A kept everything, and State B, the only equilibrium thing for State B to do was to be a complete pushover and say, okay, fine, keep the whole dollar to yourself. I'll just sit here. Right? Well, that's a bit of a bummer. Notice that there were Nash equilibria where that wasn't true. Let's think through the Nash equilibria. So suppose that states A and B simultaneously made a choice. I'm not going to be able to draw a picture of it with an assurance logo or whatever. But imagine that state A had to choose a number between 0 and 1. X. They had to choose some X between 0 and 1. And simultaneously, state B had to choose a number. And let's call it Y. And they would accept when X was less than or equal to Y. And they would reject if it was strictly greater than. Okay, so for example, suppose that x equals 1/2, so state A chooses 1/2, and state B chooses the strategy, except if x is less than or equal to 1/2, and reject if x is strictly greater than 1/2. Consider that strategy. Consider the strategy where x equals 1/2 and y equals 1/2. Does either player want to deviate? Well, hold state B's accept reject strategy fixed. State A, if they deviated something strictly less than 1/2, it would get accepted using state B's strategy. It would get accepted, and state A would get something strictly worse than 1/2, which is what they're getting right now. So they wouldn't want to deviate that way. And if they deviated higher, if they deviated to some x strictly greater than 1/2, then that would get rejected using state B's current strategy, right? That would get rejected, and so they wouldn't do any better. They would get 0. That wouldn't be a profitable deviation. So state A has no profitable deviations. What about state B? Well, let's say that state B chose a higher threshold. Let's say that they were rejecting at 3/4 instead, just to animate things. So suppose that state B was accepting if x is less than or equal to 3/4 and rejecting otherwise. Okay? Well, for starters, that would give state A an incentive to deviate. That would give state A an incentive to deviate. But if they were rejecting x equals 1/2 instead, then they would be getting 0 here instead of 1/2. So they can't make it go any higher because that would give state A a reason to deviate. And they can't make their threshold go any lower because it would give state B a reason to deviate. They would have wished that they had accepted that, and then they would get something instead of nothing. So neither state has an incentive to deviate. Now, there's nothing special about 1/2. I could have gone through this entire exercise where x equals 0 and y equals 0. X equals 1/4 and y equals 1/4. X equals your birthday over 1 plus your birthday, and so does y. X equals pi over 1 plus pi. X equals a Google over a Google plus 1. X equals every number you could ask for. There's an infinite number of Nash equilibria in this game. Some egalitarian, some very unegalitarian. There's an infinite number of straight up Nash equilibria of the Ultimatum game. And yet there's a unique subgame perfect equilibrium. There's a unique time respecting equilibrium, right? That has this very perverse substantive flavor. What's with that? Well, we refer to that as first mover advantage. We had a world where if there was no time, state A there's no reason to think that state A would do any better than state B. There's an infinite number of equilibria. Some favor A, some favor B, some favor nobody. But once we analyzed in a way that respected the game's inherent time structure, then state A got everything. So in a very real sense, state A got procedural advantages conferred upon them by being the first mover. There's an advantage to moving first in many strategic interactions. Not all, but some, including this one. So there's a first mover advantage. However, that is not the only force at work. There are two ways, at least, to do well in bargaining. One is to have procedural benefits. Under anarchy, it might be attack first. In international institutions, it might be have procedural advantages so that you get to set the terms. For international political economy, it might be, have people set to your currency so that you're the one that get to make the adjustments, and everybody else has to react to you. There's all sorts of different ways to get first mover advantages that are either move fast under anarchy, or in the context of an institution, set yourself up in a way that allows you to move first de facto. So these procedural benefits are a big source of getting good outcomes in bargaining processes. But they're not the only way. We could change the model a little bit and completely nullify, or at least render an egalitarian outcome. We can make one and only one change to the model. I could make one and only one change to the model as it sits, and wind up with a subgame perfect equilibrium of 1/2, 1/2, where x equals 1/2 and it gets accepted. Right? I could make the completely happy egalitarian outcome happen. How? Pause the video. What one change would I make to this model? And it's a very precise change. I would change one and only one thing, and I could make the outcome x equals 1/2, which is accepted, and it yields a utility imputation of 1/2, 1/2. What would I do? Welcome back. I could give state B bargaining power, the other source of power in a game like the Ultimatum game. What would that mean? I would set the disagreement point for state B to 1/2. So, suppose now that state B was getting 1/2, then we would have to choose a strategy that respected that. Suppose that X was strictly greater than 1/2. State B observes that, and that means that their payoff for accepting would be strictly less than 1/2. Well, given that they could get 1/2 for disagreement, they would reject an offer. They would reject any offer that features X greater than 1/2. Similarly, they would accept any offer that sets X less than 1/2. Now that there's a reservation value of 1/2, the accept-reject thing happens when X equals 1/2. So if X equals 1/2, then state B could accept or reject, because that's the point where they're indifferent. Now it's not X equals 1 makes them indifferent. Now it's X equals 1/2 makes them indifferent. Well, what does that mean for state A and their best offer to make? Well, if they make an offer where X is strictly greater than 1/2, that gets rejected now, and they get 0 happiness points. And if they make an offer where X is strictly less than 1/2, that gets accepted and they get to keep X. So now this little, where do we find ourselves? Are they accepting when indifferent or rejecting when indifferent? That's happening at 1/2 now rather than at 1. But regardless, the same logic holds. There isn't a largest number strictly less than 1/2 either. So suppose that state B accepts when indifferent. That's going to be a recurring theme. So now the best offer that state A could make is X equals 1/2. It gets accepted, and that's our unique subgame perfect equilibrium. So merely by adjusting the disagreement point, merely by giving state B a better outside option, merely by saying the status quo isn't so bad for state B, we have completely nullified the first mover advantage that state A had. Right? So first mover advantage means that state A essentially gets to keep all of the benefits of the bargaining range. But giving B bargaining power means that the bargaining range favors them now. So the big punchline here is that there are two sources of power in bargaining situations. One is have procedural benefits. Move first. Set the terms, set the agenda. Be the person that makes the first offer. You get the best outcome within the bargaining range. You're the person, of all the people that get to be happy at the bargaining range, you're the one person. However, the terms of the bargaining range are themselves endogenous to how strong everybody is going into it, or how good their outside option is. If we have to walk away from the deal, how bad off am I versus how bad off are you? And those two things are, as they interplay, are a really important part of international relations. Now, it might not be obvious to you just yet, so I want to amend this model a little bit to make it a more obvious bargaining model of war type model. So I want you to keep this logic as clean and as tight as you can, because we're going to use it again. So I hope that you understand this. Go back and rewind if you have to, and then once you've come back here and you feel good about things, let's go to the B block. Very good. So what makes your disagreement point good under international anarchy? Well, it kind of depends on what we're bargaining over. Suppose that we were bargaining over the terms of trade. We're two countries and we're bargaining over the terms of trade. We're England and Portugal thinking about trading cloth and wine with one another. If we fail to strike a deal to trade with one another, then that means that we're left to our own devices, right? So whether or not we're happy or sad if we don't make a deal depends on how well we produce cloth and wine in our respective home economies, right? So it could be that having a good disagreement point, having bargaining power, is about having high economic capacity so that you can walk away from trade deals. Of course, the more classic answer to this sort of thing lies in international security. The way that you have a good disagreement point is to be very strong. Have it be the case that if somebody fights you because our bargaining broke down and now we have to fight a war, have it be the case that whoever fights you has a pretty low chance of beating you. They're going to get beaten pretty bad. Carry a big stick sort of stuff. Or be very resolved, be resolute, have low war costs. These are the traditional two parameters for that sort of thing. But regardless, in international security under anarchy, the source of bargaining power is military might Being good at fighting? That's the ultima ratio. So let's amend our model just with the traditional bargaining model of war sort of payoffs. So let's suppose that we have the same ultimatum game, but now we're officially going to refer to this as the bargaining model of war. So in our introductory bargaining model of war, State A makes an offer. Call it X between 0 and 1. How much of the territory does State A get to keep versus how much of the territory does State B get to keep? And State B can accept or reject the offer. If they accept, it's X and 1 minus X, just like before. But if they reject, we go to war. The expected utility of war for each state, then, is P minus CA for State A, where P is the probability that State A would win a war if they fought one, and 1 minus P minus CB for State B. So we have now parameterized the disagreement point. We're saying, I can tell you how good of an outside option a state has by thinking through how good they are at fighting and how high or low their war costs are. And we assume that CA and CB are strictly positive. An important thing here is that war is inefficient, right? The disagreement point is still Pareto dominated. Notice that P minus CA plus 1 minus P minus CB is just 1 minus CA minus CB. So it's the whole pie minus the war costs. Whereas over here in the happy world, where we agreed, X plus 1 minus X, that adds to 1. Right? So I can always find a peaceful agreement. Let's talk about how we know that. Right? So here we are, P minus CA, 1 minus P minus CB. And if P is very high, that means that State A is very strong, and so P minus CA is big. And if P is very low, then that means that State B is very strong, and that means that State A's reservation value is bad, and State B's reservation value is good. Power makes you a good bargainer in international relations. Well, now we need to think through what backwards induction looks like in this slightly richer world that we have. Throughout, I'm going to act on the assumption, which is probably a bad one, that you have internalized the idea that in order for there to be an equilibrium in a game of this type, State B will accept when indifferent. So throughout, I'm going to say there won't be equilibria if we're rejecting when indifferent, because the cross-cutting incentives of bargaining means that one state will have to try to find the largest number strictly less than some number. It might be 0, it might be 1, it might be P plus CB, whatever. We need to see acceptance when indifferent, otherwise this is all going to break down. So now I'm assuming it, not really assuming. Now I'm just skipping a bunch of steps and not having to yell at you so much and not having to do this so much, and we'll be just fine, okay? So throughout, lock that in. Lock it in, but remember that that's a result. That's not an assumption, that's a result. It's locked in. This is my lock-in gesture. I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. It's week 11. I'm just pushing. We're doing our best. Okay. So that means that State B would only accept an offer if 1 minus X, their payoff from that offer, 1 minus X, which is endogenous, remember, it depends on the X. So they observe the X and they say, under this X, I get to keep 1 minus X of it. And I will accept that deal if 1 minus X is greater than or equal to my disagreement payoff, my payoff for rejecting. Well, the payoff for rejecting we just parameterized. That's 1 minus P minus CB. Okay. Well, what does that mean for X then? So 1 minus X has got to be greater than or equal to 1 minus P minus CB. You do some the algebra. Oh my goodness, I hate that. So they accept if X is less than or equal to P plus CB. Otherwise, they reject. If X is strictly greater than P plus CB, they reject. And if it's less than or equal to P plus CB, they accept. Notice that they accept more deals when P is high. So if State A is very strong relative to State B, then State B is a much more willing bargaining partner. They're like, oh yeah, sure, keep everything. Please don't hit me. You're so strong. Please don't hit me. Similarly, if State B's costs of war are very high, they are a more pliant bargaining partner. Right? So these two things, they get more and more willing to accept deals as they get weaker and weaker and less resolute. Just a bunch of tiny lessons, just tiny lessons, and they all add up. Tiny lessons, tiny ones. tiny steps up the mountain. Well, now we have to think through state A's decision. So you might be tempted to think, you're thinking to yourself right now, well, the disagreement point for state A is P minus CA, right? So if state A is really strong or has really low war costs, then you might be thinking to yourself, well, maybe state A is going to be trying to make a bad offer because maybe their expected utility of war is really good. You might be thinking that thought. The disagreement payoff for state A is a complete red herring in this model. It has nothing to do with the outcome. Nothing. I'm about to show you that. Because you might be thinking, strong countries will make really nasty deals that get rejected and then they go to war and they don't care because they're strong. You might be thinking that. That's a reasonable thing to think. That's a very reasonable thing to be thinking right now. If your brainwaves are on, you've thought that thought for about 10 seconds. At least. Okay? The question is, how long should you let it linger? Do you have to let it linger? Do you have to? Do you have to? Do you have to let it linger? Well, now let's think through what state A would get as a function of their offers. Notice that P plus CB is greater than 0. So as a cut point, the picture is going to look just like it did before, okay? So if state A sets x equals to 0, 0 is less than P plus CB, right? So state B will accept that. And state A gets 0. I'm not going to be able to choose individual numbers now because I don't know where P plus CB is. Maybe P is super big or maybe it's super small. But I do know that up until P plus CB, you make an offer, it gets accepted, and you get to keep it. So right along the 45-degree line, just like before, you get to keep that. Okay? So they just kind of keep climbing up the mountain and they keep doing better and better and better. Okay? And we decided that we're going to assume, because it's a result, we're going to assume the state B accepts when indifferent. And so this line goes all the way to P plus CB. Right? And so we get to the top of the mountain and it's P plus CB. And so state A makes an offer of P plus CB, which gets accepted. And state A gets to keep P plus CB. Now suppose we went a little bit to the right. What's the payoff? What's the payoff? Pause the video. What's the payoff? Where is it in the picture? Where is it in this picture? If state A makes an offer strictly higher than P plus CB, what happens? What would be their payoff? Pause the video. What do they get if they fight? What do they get? Welcome back to the one of you that paused the video to go to the bathroom. Well, they get P minus CA. And that's worse. Right? I got P here, I got P plus CB here, and I got P minus CA here. This is just a different characterization of the canonical bargaining range. This is the bargaining range this way. It's everywhere. It exists independent of our pictures of it. The bargaining range exists independent of the pictures, which means that along the way, we're going to see it from so many angles. We're going to see it this way. We're going to see it this way. The bargaining range is everywhere because it is a thing. So this is our range. So we go up the mountain, up to P plus CB, and then if we go too far to the right, if we go past P plus CB, if we're state A, if we make too big of an offer, it drops down to war and P minus CA, which is strictly less than P plus CB. Why? Because the costs are positive. P plus CB is greater than P minus CA. Otherwise, war wouldn't be inefficient. If war wasn't costly, this thing would have zipped itself shut. But war is costly. People die. Things don't get made. And it doesn't have to be war. If it's like a sanction, there's a lot less development in the world. Somebody dies that way too. It just doesn't, we don't make a movie about it. If we don't strike an agreement upon the appropriate definition about what counts as Greek yogurt, then some companies will not do as well. And that's important too. The ultimate lesson of bargaining in the shadow of conflict is that there are two main ways for us to transfer things with one another. We have two primary conventions. One is exchange and one is conflict. And bargaining is what happens if we think about how to make exchanges in the shadow of fearing conflict. So if we fail to exchange, then we do conflict, and conflict is definitionally the inefficient mechanism of transfer. Exchange is the efficient mechanism, That was x and 1 minus x. The whole pie was preserved. Exchange is efficient. Conflict is inefficient. So long as we go through the conflictual route, so long as we sanction or fight a war or whatever it is, we're necessarily creating positive costs, creating this bargaining range, and making P plus CB strictly greater than P minus CA, so that the unique subgame perfect equilibrium of this game now is state A offers P plus CB, and state B accepts all offers less than or where X is less than or equal to P plus CB, and rejects offers where X is strictly greater than P plus CB. That's the unique equilibrium, just like before, but it means so much more than you might have realized. It's all in there. It's all in there. The ultimatum game requires only small tweaks. And there's so many cool things that you can learn so many amazing lessons from it. Just by poking at it, just by saying, and what if I did this? And then it's not that hard to do the analysis, right? So once you've seen the analysis one time, once you've drawn one of these pictures, it's not that hard to think through. And it's not that hard to figure out what the outcome is going to be. It's kind of mechanical at a certain point in time, which means, this is great news, because that means that you can amend this week sometime. Because you all have so much time on your hands. This week sometime, you could come up with 3 or 4 tweaks to put on the ultimatum game to make it realistic for one set of affairs that you care about or another. Trade, sanctions, alliances, fighting, environment, institutions, whatever. There's an ultimatum game for it. There's a whole bunch of ultimatum games for it, and they're all easy to solve. Once you kind of know what you're doing and you don't have a nuclear meltdown because you don't want to solve an infinite number of subgames, once you know what you're doing, it's not that bad, right? And you're like, well, why don't we talk after I know what I'm doing? And I'm like, see you at the problem set on Monday. And you're like, I hate this class. So actually, the thing I'm going to put on the problem set is a one additional wrinkle. I'm going to take the first ultimatum game that I showed you and this ultimatum game and smush them and say, well, what happens if disagreement doesn't necessarily lead to war, but where war is also an option? What kind of offers do you have to make then? You know, it's kind of funny when you think about it, because in order to do backward induction on this, we have to give a complete characterization of what state B will do at each of their infinite nodes. And so it seems like we're doing a really sophisticated analysis of state B, and then state A only makes one decision. But in reality, because of the shadow of the future, because of the role the future plays in rationalist international relations theory, because of sequential rationality as it applies to time, because of these things we've been talking about, it's state A that has the really hard decision. All state B has to do is look at this offer that they get and compare it to their disagreement point and then say, we're fighting or we're not. State A this is a hint for your problem set. It's state A that has the hard problem. State A has a lot to think through. Bargaining. The bargaining model of war. War is the continuation of politics by other means. These all mean the same thing. They all mean we all want to make exchanges, but we fear conflict, and the terms of conflict influence the terms of exchange. That's it. That's a huge lesson. That's a huge lesson. If you can internalize that, that's a very big lesson to learn. Notice that I've been showing you a lot of models of war that don't have any war in them. Right? The only model of war that we've written down where war actually happened was the issue and divisibility problem from the problem set. And so I think it's probably come time for us to think about how to use this apparatus to find a cause of war that is of some use. And so I want to talk about the problem of preventative war in the C block. So see you there. So I want to talk about the problem of preventative war, which is inherently a time-respecting problem, right? So again, the issue with preventative war is that I might not want to fight you today, but I might not want to wait around for you to get stronger tomorrow. And so consequently, we need to think about how a potential power shift in the future influences the decision to fight today. Okay? Now I'm going to write down a simple non-ultimatum version of the model that then on the problem set I'll amend to include an ultimatum, and then you'll do the complete analysis. But I just want to show you this cause of war in a stripped down version before we worry too much about what the ultimatum version of it looks like, okay? So let me just cue up a theory of preventive war. The preventive war game actually looks just like a deterrence game, but with some more elaborate payoffs. And the idea goes like this. At the beginning of time, State A, the first mover, can either attack or wait. Okay? And by attack, we mean hit them first. Hit now. Right? The idea here is that State B is going to be getting stronger in the second phase of the game. So State A is thinking, I can hit them now, or I can get weaker in the future. Okay? And the idea is that hit now goes to a terminal node called 2 rounds of war. All right? You'll see why it's 2 rounds here in just a second. However, they can also wait. They can say, okay, I'm not going to attack you today. I hope you don't get too much stronger in the future. And then State B has the same choice. They can either attack or wait. And either way will go to a terminal node, although you can imagine this sort of going for many iterations. The basic idea here is that if we wait, we get a status quo payoff. Every time period that elapses where we wait gives us a status quo payoff. Okay? So I'll say that the status quo payoff for State A is S sub A, and the status quo payoff for B is S sub B. So in particular, if State A waits at the beginning of time and then State B waits, the payoff is 2 times SA for State A and 2 times SB for State B. They got 2 trips to the SA buffet table. Apparently it's a buffet is the status quo. The status quo is an international relations buffet. Week 11. Week 11! I gotta start scripting these things. Okay, so 2 SA and 2 SB. That's the payoffs for peace. If there's never a war, you get 2 hits of the status quo happiness. Okay? I'm going to make an assumption about how big SA is here in a moment, but let me introduce the rest of the model. So suppose instead that State A attacked at the beginning of the time. You said, you know what? I don't feel like waiting around for you to get stronger. I'm going to attack you now. Okay. Well, that means 2 rounds of war. So it's going to be 2 times P minus CA and 2 times 1 minus P minus CB. And you're like, well, why did I have to fight twice? I'm just trying to keep this super simple. Right, this is the easiest version of a preventative war model. So P minus CA, 1 minus P minus CB multiplied by 2 for both of them. You get 2 rounds of that. And then the magic is going to be what happens if State B is the attacker, and you'll see that it's going to blend the 2. Okay. So finally, suppose that if State A waits and then State B attacks, now that they're strong, well, State A would get SA. They would get 1 round of status quo because they were nice at the beginning of time. So they get SA plus a war payoff here at the end of time. Okay? And now it's going to be P minus delta P, where by delta P, I mean the change in power. Delta P is going to be a bump in the power of State B in the second time period. So we're saying that State B is stronger so that the P goes down by a little bit or a lot. Okay? So the idea here is that delta P lives somewhere between 0 and P. So we could take it all the way down to 0, or we could leave it right where it is. So if delta P is small, then that's a small power shift. If delta P is large, that's a big power shift. All right? This delta P parameter is our way of encoding State A is declining and State B is rising. By how much? By delta P. Okay. Minus CA, right? So the final payoff is SA because you were nice for 1 round, plus P minus delta P minus CA. As for State B, well, their payoff is SB. They were nice. They got 1 round of happiness. They got status quo payoffs for 1 round because State A was nice at the beginning of time. And then they get a war payoff here. So it's 1 minus P plus delta P. Right? So we took the 1 minus P, their original probability of victory, and we added, they get the delta P. They're the rising state. They're getting stronger. Minus CB. Okay? So it's, if it's peace forever, 2SA, 2SB. If it was war at the very beginning, 2 P minus CA, 2 1 minus P minus CB. And then at this intermediate one where state A didn't attack and state B attacked, then that takes us to SA plus P minus delta P minus CA. You know, a worse expected utility for war, a worse one because you're weaker in the future, state A, and SB plus 1 minus P plus delta P minus CB. And we're going to assume that the SAs are big, they're good enough that they could be accepted in any given phase. So in particular, that means that SA is greater than or equal to P minus CA, and SB is greater than or equal to 1 minus P minus CB. And that just keeps things interesting. So we need to handle this via good old-fashioned backward induction. So let's go to state B's decision at the end of time. Well, state B is comparing SA plus 1 minus P plus delta P minus CB, which is their payoff if they attack, against 2 SB. So consider first the world where state B doesn't want to attack. Suppose that SB, their payoff for the status quo, is greater than or equal to their war payoff even when they're strong, 1 minus P plus delta P minus CB. So if they want peace at the end of time, if that second hit of status quo goodies, if that's big enough, then they don't want to fight. Okay? And that means that state A could expect to see, if that were true, then state A would expect to see waiting. They'd expect to see waiting. And so state A is thinking, well, if I wait, then state B will wait, and I will get 2 SA, which is strictly better than 2 times P minus CA, because we assumed that SA was bigger than P minus CA. And so there's an equilibrium. If it is true that SB is greater than or equal to 1 minus P plus delta P minus CB, if it's true, that's an if, but if that's true, then the equilibrium is state A waits, state B waits. Easy. So if state B's status quo payoffs are big enough, this game isn't very interesting. Big enough with respect to what? Big enough with respect to delta P. We already knew that SB was bigger than 1 minus P minus CB. The big thing here is it's also bigger than 1 minus P minus CB plus delta P. So delta P wasn't enough to change anything. It didn't suddenly make them warlike. Okay? So that's one equilibrium. That's the happy equilibrium. Now suppose that condition wasn't true. Suppose instead that SB was strictly less than 1 minus P minus CB plus delta P. Suppose instead that state B wants war in the future. Well, then what's going to happen? Well, state A, they're either going to be deterred by that or they're not, right? What would deter them? Well, it depends on whether or not that status quo benefit of being nice for one round is enough to make getting hit worth it, okay? So in particular, suppose that SA was greater than or equal to P plus delta P minus CA. Which is to say, if that status quo, if that perk is big enough to offset, So we need to think through state A's decision then. So they know that if they wait, they're going to get attacked right now. Okay, the question is, do they want to get attacked? Do they mind getting attacked that much? Well, that depends. Right now, if they attack today, then they get 2P minus 2CA. And they get 2 rounds of war payoff at the old, when they're still strong. All right? However, if they wait, then they get attacked, and they get SA plus P minus delta P minus CA. So in other words, state A would rather attack if SA plus P minus delta P minus CA is greater than or equal to 2P minus 2CA. Their payoff are down here, right? This is just like the deterrence model, it's just there's some more terms happening. Don't let your confusion about the terms turn into confusion about the structure of the game. The game is still simple. It's still just a deterrence model. Okay? It's just with a slightly different fable around it. So if SA, you can do some algebra here. If SA is greater than or equal to P plus delta P minus CA. So if the status quo payoff is good, if they enjoy that one perk of benefit, then they would rather wait. They would rather wait, enjoy the one period of happy payoff, and then get hit. And if that condition is not satisfied, then they would rather fight. They'd rather just fight today. It's not worth it. The status quo payoff, if the status quo isn't very good for the strong country, they'd rather just hit you now while they're still strong. They don't want, what do they care about that stupid status quo payoff? What do they care about this little incentive? They don't care. They don't care. They'd rather hit you while they're strong than wait for delta P to happen and get this measly SA as compensation. So if SA is small, they'd rather hit now. If SA is big, they will complacently allow themselves to decline and then get hit. So there's three equilibria. There's three equilibria depending on the conditions. Right? I mean, there's always a unique equilibrium here, except for knife edge cases, but sort of the equilibrium has one of three flavors. Either there's no war, and that happens if state B doesn't get a big enough bump that they want to attack in the future. So in the first equilibrium, because state B doesn't want to attack, right, then state A doesn't want to attack, and we get 2 units of the happiness points that we get from peace. In the second equilibrium, state B wants to attack, and state A enjoys that benefit enough that they don't care, and they don't attack and they let themselves get hit. So that's sort of war by the rising state. The war gets initiated by the rising state. And in the third equilibrium, state A says, you know what, screw it. I'm not getting enough benefits from the status quo. I'm going to hit you now while I'm still strong. Preventative war. So we have 3 different things here. We have peace, we have preventative war, and we have sort of war by the rising power in the future as the equilibrium outcomes. So this straightforward deterrence model isn't that hard to turn into a preventative war model. It's just about the story. The delta P, all we did was introduce this delta P and say that it helps state B and it hurts state A, and suddenly we had a new model on our hands. Completely new model. And what we're going to do is we're going to fuse this on the problem set. I'm going to fuse this model with an ultimatum game, and you're just really looking forward to it. But I think that you'll see there's a lot of very interesting, it's a nuanced decision that gets made, and preventative war it seems like such a blunt policy instrument. Oh, I see another country is getting stronger, and I'm not satisfied enough with the status quo that I want to fight, so that I want to not fight, so I'm just going to fight preventatively. That seems like a 5-year-old can understand that logic, but it turns out there's a lot to it. There's a lot of wrinkles to that particular decision. Getting that right, doing the best version of that isn't easy. It isn't easy at all. That's kind of the fun of this, is any 5-year-old could figure this logic out, but getting it really right is actually a real craft. So what do we talk about today? Well, for the most part, I wanted to talk about the ultimatum game and how you analyze it. I wanted us to take some time to say subgame perfection, backward induction. There are some particular nuances that arise from continuous action spaces, from being able to choose out of the whole hoodie logo. And we learned a couple of important substantive lessons just from it. We learned that the ultimatum game told us that bargaining power arises from 2 places. One is procedural. Be the first mover. Be the person that gets to set the terms of the happiness. Be the person that says, I'm going to determine which element of the bargaining range I'm going to pick. I'm the person that gets to choose that. I'm the powerful person. So procedural benefits, acting swiftly, having institutional advantages, having a currency advantage, having some cultural advantage, whatever it is, it allows you to move faster, set terms, set agendas, and enjoy the benefits of first mover under bargaining. But we also saw that the quality of your outside option, your bargaining power, how good your disagreement point is just as important. And having a good disagreement point, it turns out, is a substantively rich puzzle. You know, I think that the shadow of the future plays a really important role in not just formal international relations theory, but in informal international relations theory. Preventative war was a thought long before ultimatum games were thought of. What's cool about this isn't the math. What's cool about this is the encoding of venerable and ancient thoughts. Remember that Thucydides told us that the reason for the Peloponnesian War was the rise in Athenian power and the fear that that caused in Sparta. Sparta was thinking ahead. Sparta was looking down the tree. Sparta was worried about delta P for Athens. Crazy thought when you think about it, right? This is not a math class. This is not a math class. And so I really wanted to leave the lion's share of the analysis for the problem set. Not because it's not going to be hard analysis. Don't get yourself too concerned. Easy for me to say, I know. None of this should be super duper hard, but I really want you to be the one doing the digging. I just wanted this lecture to get you excited about studying bargaining in a dynamic sense. Intertemporal bargaining, where the shadow of the future looms large. And I hope that that gets you excited and also the logic is clear enough that you're ready to go and dig. You're going to have 2 problems on your problem set. They're both going to be pretty extensive in the sense that you have to be an active analyst. You have to put on your analyst hat and really think a problem through all the way, probably for the first time in the class, really thinking through everything fully deeply. This should be when a lot of things begin to come together. But I should also note that the models that we're writing down are in some sense incomplete, and it's with that sense of incompleteness in mind that I'd like to conclude with a provocative thought. Suppose we wrote down a contract. We're 2 countries, we wrote down a contract with one another saying that we promise to not attack one another ever again. We promise we will never attack you. We will never attack one another. We are nice, we are friends, we don't attack one another. Look how good of friends we are. As of today, take a snapshot of today. Ka-ching! And look, today, in 2020, we signed this deal. We trade a lot. We haven't fought in a long time. There's cultural exchange. There's free exchange of ideas. Students go from my country to your universities and vice versa. Workers flow freely across our borders. We are not only do we not fight, we are besties at the country level. Okay? And so we decide that we want to proclaim that to the world by saying that we will never attack one another. We promise that we will never attack one another ever again. We write that contract down. There's a big ceremony with special pens and brie and pigs in a blanket and a string quartet. Okay, it's a very big deal. We signed this. We won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a huge deal. We just did all sorts of amazing by proclaiming peace for the rest of time. Much like last week's provocative thought, the same idea obtains here. Once we write down a deal, there's no reason to think that it itself is credible. We need self-reinforcing commitment. We need it to be the case that the mechanisms that we design to buttress our peace deals must be self-enforcing. They must be credible. It must be the case that we actually enjoy the benefits of the status quo enough to outweigh how strong somebody is in the future. Somebody could keep getting stronger. Their P could keep changing. It's not just a my P today, my P tomorrow. Countries, their power ebbs and flows every day. Power flows every day and has flowed every day since we've started having sticks that we use to put into one another's flesh. There is no end to that process. There is no end to that process. There is no equilibrium of our power. It doesn't equilibrate. The laws of physics don't apply to our power. There need not be a steady state in terms of who is strong and who is not. So that deal that we wrote down, yeah, that's great. And it might hold for a very long time. But one day it might not. And everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. Nobody takes that deal seriously. It's great that we got to have some brie. It's good that we got to practice our dancing. Whatever. It's great. State dinners, white ties, wonderful. I got a whole lot of things in my beard. It's great. But it doesn't mean anything. It's a scrap of paper. And it's not a scrap of paper because of bad intentions. It's not a scrap of paper because it doesn't work for a long amount of time. It's a scrap of paper because the problem is ill-posed. The problem of knowing what the future will look like is so ill-posed. The only reason that you would write such a thing down is because you didn't want to look like an idiot in the near future. That's it. That's it. That's the only reason. You don't want to look like an idiot in the future. And if it conferred enough benefits in the immediate short term, you wouldn't even mind look like an idiot after that. But why would it confer any benefits? Everybody knows that it's cheap talk. I say this because power isn't the only thing that changes over time. It's a very important thing that changes over time, but it's not the only thing. Industrial capacity changes over time. Technology changes over time. Population changes over time. Right? So sort of the raw components, not just of power, but of national capacity, change over time. Preferences change over time. The things that we enjoy consuming today are not the same things that our grandparents enjoyed consuming. Preferences change, and so prices change. The things that we care about change. Everything is constantly ebbing and flowing. Information ebbs and flows over time as well. You learn things, and I learn things, and over time we get more data and we make decisions, but the informational thing is especially problematic. I say this because cheap talk is going to be more than just a power thing for us. You know, this week's problem set will be the beginning of a bit of a cheap talk theme for the rest of the class. But we're going to have to go deeper. Now, clearly, cheap talk itself depends on time. Cheap talk is dynamic. I can make promises now. I can talk about how strong I am now. But I have to live up to them in the future. So I need time for cheap talk to be a relevant concept. But I also need information to be relevant. I need to not be pretending to be somebody else when I'm issuing my cheap talk and say, I'm the sort of person that keeps his promises. I'm the sort of person that wins his fights. When I lie about something like that, it isn't just time that made it cheap talk. It's also the fact that I am not a person that keeps promises or that I am not a person that wins fights. So without a sense about information and what you know and don't know about me, whether talk is cheap or not is it's only a power thing at that point in time. And so today's lesson would be fully decisive on the topic, but it's not decisive. So we're going to do 1 week about where institutions come from next week. But after that, we'll spend the remaining 4 weeks of the class talking about incomplete information, where I know things about me that you don't, and you know things about you that I don't, or something like that. And so I want you to remember this lecture about bargaining, and the shadow of the future, and the problem of preventative war, and the wrinkles about setting a slider just right. Because we're going to need to talk about cheap talk in a much richer way than we have up to this point. This provocative thought and last week's, they're both provocative, they're both important. Time is longer than we realize, time horizons are long, and every day really is a chance to not live up to your commitments. But every day is also a chance for you to lie. And the only way that you could lie is if you knew something that somebody else didn't. I want this to be something that's in your mind as we go into the next few lectures, because it'll make it easier for you to navigate the real difficulties associated with incomplete information game theory if you have some orientation. If I just start the incomplete information lectures and say, and suppose that there's some parameter that one country knows and the other one doesn't, it's going to get very abstract very quickly, and it's not going to be very much fun. And you're like, it hasn't been fun up to this point, fat man. Point well taken. And I want it to be fun. I want the informational stuff to be something that really sticks in your mind. And the best way for the informational stuff to be something that sticks in your mind is for this lecture to be something that sticks in your mind too. You know, I made a joke today about the accumulation of tiny lessons until you have a giant pile of tiny lessons, and I think it's really true. You know, so getting to where you're going, I talk about like where you're headed, and it might sound like I'm thinking that you're going to turn into a scholar or something, and that isn't it. That isn't why I say to get where you're going or your goals ought to be. It's not because I want you to be a scholar. It's because I think that understanding is such a personal thing that there is a goal of capital U understanding, which might be an impossible goal, but I want you to have that goal in mind. And I want you to think about how you interface with yourself as you head toward understanding. And that's why it's so important to revel in the tiny lessons, but also to show how the tiny lessons link to one another. So the things that I showed you today, they're tiny lessons, some of which are profound, but still tiny. But they wouldn't mean nearly as much if you weren't in position to link them to the next few tiny lessons too. It's a hard thing as a teacher to do, especially in this format. I wish that I had so much continuity. I wish that I could I wish that I could read your body language a little bit to see if you were linking weeks together, and I just can't. And it makes me feel sheepish about showing you tiny lessons because I don't know if you're getting the accumulated benefits, if you're seeing that the whole of the tiny lessons is so much more than the sum of the parts. I hope that you see that, and I hope that those of you that don't will take today's lecture and the opportunities for learning more about Cheap Talk in the next few weeks. I hope that that'll be a last chance for me to convince you that the whole really is so much more than the sum of the parts. And I view that as my job. But no matter what, thanks for watching.